So my job then, I set about 4 years ago to figure out what the stratigraphy is so that eventually I can make my way up to that location and figure out where that dinosaur site is. What I've found in going over that area, I've only covered about 80 square miles of the 120 square miles at this point in time. I'm about wore out, and none of my field assistants will come back and help me the next year. They all get worn out. So some of the things that I've found, I'm reporting on. This is all part of the Lance project, trying to figure out the structure of the Lance. First of all, we have shell beds. There are certain layers that have lots of shells. This looks like lots of shells. Yeah, and you follow these crazy things for a half mile in all directions. That's a huge number of shells. This is not what you find in braided streams. You just don't find shell beds spread over half a mile in all directions in braided stream situations. So something's not quite right with the braided stream interpretation. Plus, a number of these shelves are actually closed, and you know that a pelecypod clam shell, when it dies, it releases the hold on the shells, and the shells open up. So when we find closed shells, especially when we find most of the specimens being closed, it means that the little clams were alive at the time they were buried. These clearly didn't live here. They wouldn't live in this high a concentration. They were carried here, but they were carried here while they were still alive. So they were disinterred from wherever they were living, carried to this location, and spread over a huge area by some process. Second observation, we've got bone beds. One of the beds, the most famous at this point, would be the bed that Art Chadwick has been digging dinosaur bones out of. Since 1996, when we first went out there and set things up there, he's been going out every year and collecting about 1,000 dinosaur bones out of one bone bed, out of one layer that is less than 3 feet thick. He's been taking out 1,000 bones every year, and you can barely see that he's made a scratch on what's there. We figure you can do that for 500-600 years and still not even get off the ranch that it's found on. There's at least 5,000 acres of this bone bed. Many tens of thousands of specimens of Edmontosaurus, basically one species of dinosaur. So that's one bone bed. It's not the only one. There are several bone beds in the unit. That one has been studied the most. What's interesting about this bone bed, and this is a picture not from his locality, it's one from about 2 miles away, something like that. A ranch owner was having someone dig out some Triceratops bones so that he could sell them. And I got a chance to take photographs of the site before they ripped everything out and sold it. And this was interesting to me because the formation, you can see the layers of mudstone, of shale here. See that here. The dinosaur bones, here's one here, here's one here, here's one here. The dinosaur bones are not in the layering of the formation. In fact, this one is perpendicular to the layering. It's really interesting when I talk to the excavator, who's, again, he's just in the business to sell bones. He digs them up, sells them, gives a certain percentage to the landowner, and keeps the rest for himself. I asked him, well, what do you think about all this? And he gives me the standard story, the braided stream and all of that. I said, well, what about this bone? It's vertical. He says, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't understand that. What he's going to do is he's going to take that bone out and he's going to put it with the other bones. He's going to lose the information on its orientation, and it's all lost. And that's the problem. That's what I don't like about people who dig out dinosaur bones and fossils in general. They don't care beans about the situation. I sort of see myself as a forensic paleontologist, someone who's going in to figure out what happened here. How did this critter die? Well, if it was a human body, you wouldn't be allowed to just take the bones out without noting their orientation. That might tell you something about how they died. Might tell you, give you important information. In fact, by the time you see it put together in a museum from multiple specimens, you've lost all the important information. You actually don't know anything about that. And everything that's of interest to me has been destroyed. And here, you've got it, right there. It's vertical. How do you explain that? I said, you can't explain that. I said, here, I asked you a question, too. You've been digging in here. You took bulldozer. I saw the bulldozer sitting right there. He bulldozed the stuff off the top, and then he is working through and getting all the bones, and he's going to bulldoze ultimately all that out. And I said, did you perchance dig through 2 feet of shale, of mudstone, that you didn't find any fossils in? Yeah. How did you know? I said, on top of that, there was a sandstone, wasn't there? Yeah, there was sand rock on top. They call it sand rock. There was sand rock on top of it. Yes. Okay. And is there any place that you actually dug underneath here to see if anything's underneath? He said, yes. I said, wait a minute, before you say it. You found 2 feet of mudstone underneath with no fossils in it, with sandstone underneath that. He says, yeah, how did you know? I said, well, I've seen this a lot of times. I see a unit that's got our bones in it. Let's say it's 6 feet thick. Top 2 feet, no bones at all. Bottom 2 feet, no bones at all. All the bones are in the middle. And the bones that are in the middle, they vary from being horizontal to angled to vertical. What in the world's going on there? Well, if you know anything about Steve Austin's nautiloid bed in the Grand Canyon, we have an explanation for this formation. When you have an underwater landslide, an underwater mud flow, which is basically a bunch of mud moving as a unit underwater, let's say it wasn't underwater, let's say it was above, it was in the air that it was doing this. The bottom of the mud flow is in friction with the ground. So it's moving slower than the middle of the mud flow. The middle and the top of the mud flow are moving at a certain speed, but it's getting slowed down below that, so that if there's anything in that lower part, it gets turned and actually rotates if the thing goes far enough. And Steve's nautiloid bed goes for over 200 miles. Okay, so if it goes far enough, it'll rotate these things into the middle, and they'll be in various orientations there. Some will be flat, some will be at an angle, some will be vertical. Now, that will be if you're in the air. But if you're underwater, a significant amount of water, so that there's water bearing down on the top of it, then the top will also not be moving. And so the top portion of it will also rotate bones or anything large, anything long, will rotate into the middle. So if you're under significant depth of water, you will rotate all your big, long things into the middle zone, and they'll be at various cockeyed orientations. This is an underwater avalanche, underwater mud flow that has gone for a very long distance, probably at least tens of miles, and it's got to be under more than 100, 200 feet of water. Okay? That's not a braided stream. Okay? There is no way this can be a braided stream. So here we have evidence of an underwater mud flow that cannot be explained by the braided stream idea. Another observation, we have cross beds. We have the normal bedding of the sandstone, and then we find bedding that goes at an angle to it in a particular bed. There's angled bedding within that bed, and that's called cross bedding in that sandstone. That's indicative of the sandstone being generated by, the sand is being brought in by a current of water or air or something of that nature. So you have imagine a sand dune. Wind might carry the sand up one side of the sand dune and cascade the sand down the other side of the sand dune. So as the sand dune moves across the surface, it produces these cross beds as it does so. Water does the same thing. Water can pick up sand, carry it over the top of a dune, cascade it down the front, and produce these. In this case, the water is moving, or wind is moving this way. It's cascading down the front side and moving across the landscape. The next dune comes along and cuts the previous dune off about halfway up. So you have these things cut off at pretty high angle. They would have gone up this same height again to the top of the dune, but the next dune comes along and cuts them off. So these cross beds indicate that we had some sort of medium water or air is moving sand. And we have cross beds in excess of 3 feet. That means that the original bed forms, the original dunes, were in excess of 6 feet in height. That's a pretty big dune. You need 5 times the height of a depth of water to produce that depth of a sand dune. So a sand dune that's 6 feet high requires at least 30 feet of water. That's a lot of water, unlikely in a braided stream. Okay, you can get 30 feet of water in a narrow passage in a canyon, but braided streams are on very large plains. That's the only way you can get that braided stream. You can't get 30 feet of water in a braided stream unless you're near the coast and got the hurricane comes in and with the water in front of it. But there's no other way to do this. This is not a braided stream. Plus, we have cross beds in conglomerate. This is conglomerate. The particle size here is not sand. Sand is qualified as sand up to about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. The little particles, 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Anything above that is called a conglomerate. And air can't blow sand particles that big. It can't move them. So you can't produce these cross beds in the air. You can only produce them underwater. So we have, these things are evidence of underwater deposition with at least 30 feet of water and moving at a very good clip. Let's see. In this particular case, we've got to have a velocity of water that's in excess of 1 meter per second. That's moving very fast. And again, it's 30 feet, at least 30 feet deep over its entire breadth. That's, again, not a braided stream. It's not a situation we're familiar with in the present at all, anywhere on this earth, even in the midst of a hurricane.